All right, talking about fraction to decimal and decimal to fraction conversions. Uh, Most of it, I mean, if you're using a calculator, is incredibly easy. So it's just using the calculator appropriately and understanding what fractions mean, and then understanding what place value means in decimals. I think that you did a fantastic job of understanding place value and being able to say decimals out loud to rewrite them as fractions. Let's take a look at some examples real quick. A fraction, let's say 1/4. Well, one thing we talked about that will never happen, and I struggle to say never because it's actually not true that it will be never, but at the same time, uh, it, never is a strong word. I don't want to say never because whenever you have 1/6, it ends up being 0.16. So that's the only one that actually ends up being the two numbers in the fraction are actually in the decimal. So I mean, this is not going to be 0.14 ever. Ever, ever. Like, unless you're looking at 1/6, which is probably not going to happen because it's not a benchmark fraction, so you won't be dealing with that in middle school. I'm just saying. I just want to emphasize that. Please do not use the two numbers in the fraction as the two numbers in the decimal. What we did talk about was this is the same thing as the division symbol. We're comparing two numbers. It's a comparison of two things, a part to whole relationship. So the dots represent numbers, and whenever we're talking about a fraction, it's actually how many parts we have out of how many parts that are required. So if we have 4, we currently only have 1. So think of a pizza that looks like this. We have it cut. This is all we've got left. Your brother ate everything else, and you're like, dude, what's up? So we have 1 out of the 4 parts that are required to make one whole. So I just want to emphasize the visual because this is what the comparison is. The one that you do have out of the 4 that are not there completely. So we do know that there are 4 sections. 1, 2, 3, 4, and you have 1. So whenever you type in 1 divided by 4, you will get 0.25, or whenever we say it appropriately using place value, the tenths, hundredths, 25 hundredths. So all you have to do whenever with place value is see how far out does it go. All right, so 1, 2. So I'm going to go out 2 places, that's tenths, hundredths, and then you just say the number that you see, 25, 25 hundredths. Well, let's take another example of that, and let's rewind. What about this? Okay, so now we have 0.025, but using place value, we're going to be able to say this out loud using place value to rewrite it as a fraction. So let's see how many place values we've got. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths. All right, so we have 25 thousandths. So 25 thousandths. Out of 1,000 parts, we have 25 of them. The other part to this when converting a decimal back to a fraction is you can simplify this. I know that any numbers that end in 5 or 0 are divisible by 5. So that means I could divide the top by 5 and the bottom by 5. So you can go over to your trusty calculator, type in 25 divided by 5 and get 5, and then 1,000 divided by 5 and get 200. And if you're sitting there going, dang, I'm in the same boat again. This ends in 5 and this ends in 0. That means the 5 can go into it again. You're right. Let's reduce it some more. So 5 divided by 5 is 1, and then 200 divided by 5 is 40. So now we know the most simplified fraction, 1/40th, is equal to 0.025 or 25 thousandths. If you wanted to just kind of mess around with that a little bit, type in 1 divided by 40 on your calculator, and you'll get 0.025. So this is good practice, just going back and forth, back and forth. So the fractions that you really need to work on are 1/2. Know your halves, okay? So go ahead and make that into a decimal. Practice these. Recite these. You're walking around the hallway. 1/2 is, 1/4 is, you need 1/3, 1/4, 1/5, and 1/10. Once you have those down, we'll talk about eighths. So with your fraction, straight up calculator. These are called benchmark. So when I say know your fourths, I mean know what 1/4 is, 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4. Know what 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, 4/5, 5/5. And here's how you can do that. I'll use fifths as the example. So whenever you type 1 divided by 5, you're going to get 0.2. So if every fifth is equal to 0.2, so look, I'm just going to write down another fifth. If we add these together, look at that. 1/5 plus 1/5 is 2/5, right? 2/10 plus 2/10 is 4/10. So we know that 2/5 is going to be 4/10. My point is showing you that is if you know that 1/5 is 0.2, then you know that you're just going to be adding 0.2 for every fifth. If you know that 1/2 is 0.5, then you know that you're going to add another 0.5 to get to two halves. 2 halves is going to equal 1.0. It makes sense. A half plus a half equals 1. So if you're thinking about 1/10, you could go 1/10. That's what's cool about this one. Anything that has a base of 10 as your denominator, you're going to be able to say out loud and just rewrite it as a decimal. For example, if you take 1/5 and then you multiply the top and bottom by 2, you end up getting 2/10. And that's what we said 1/5 is equal to. 2/10. See? 1/5 is equal to 2/10. 1/5 is 2/10. So now we know with 1/10 we're just counting by 0.1 every time. So the next one would be 2/10 is 0.2, like we said with 1/5. Then 3/10 would be 0.3, 4/10 would be 0.4, and so on. So these are why they're called benchmark fractions. These are the things that you're going to run across throughout your entire life. And the only tricky one is 0.3 repeating. That's 1/3. And we talked about 0.3 repeating being an approximation as a decimal, which is why we use fractions with stuff like thirds. Because whenever you add up decimals that are repeating, you're never actually going to get to one whole. You're always going to be just a little bit off. But whenever you add 3/3 together, you get 1. So that's why thirds are a little sketchy when it comes to decimals. So practice going back and forth on those, even if you had an improper fraction, which means a number that's bigger on top. All this means is 10 divided by 2. So you'd type it in 10 divided by 2. You could think of it as a division problem in your head. You could, how many times does 2 fit into 10? Well, 5. And then whenever you get 5, you'll probably see on your calculator that it's going to have a decimal point after it. Because after every whole number, there is always going to be a thing to separate for place value. Ones place, decimal point, tenths, hundredths, thousandths. Okay, so always make sure we're matching place value whenever we are comparing decimals.